Welcome to this webinar, Inclusive Design in Action, Maximizing Accessibility in Blackboard. Some helpful information for this webinar. Closed captions are available on the WebEx platform. They can be found in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Please use the screenshot on this slide as a guide. Please note that the use of third-party AI generator software is not permitted for note-taking or recording of this session unless prior permission has been granted. Here's our agenda for the webinar so that all attendees have a more concrete idea of what will be covered. We are currently in the Welcome and Introduction section, to be followed by Contextualizing Accessibility in Education, Modernizing to Ultra, Common Accessibility Issues Found in Digital Content, Final Thoughts and Resources, and any time for questions. Very happy to be here to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Katie Grinnell. I serve as an accessibility strategist here at Anthology. I've been in this role for 3 years. It's been a fantastic experience for me. Some of the information that I have on the slide is just a little bit of my positionality, and so you have an idea of my background to help provide the reasoning why I'm here today presenting this particular webinar. So I identify as a very proud disabled woman. I have both visible and non-apparent or invisible disabilities, and the accessibility space is a very personal and professional area for me in terms of the joy it brings to my work and to my life. So I'm happy to be able to participate in this and to talk a little bit about it. I have a PhD in American Studies with a focus on disability studies and history. So that's essentially where I made my segue into the accessibility world. I've been teaching actually for over 18 years as an adjunct instructor in both history, American popular music, and disability studies at a variety of different colleges throughout the area of Western New York and some online. And I am also the proud co-author of a book called Disability and Accessibility in the Music Classroom, an Instructor's Guide. So very happy to be here. And again, I do hope that this is a helpful session and helps you think a little bit about how to incorporate addressing accessibility as you're making that transition to Ultra. At the end of this webinar, learners will be able to identify common accessibility issues to address, apply best practices for accessible course design, and develop an accessibility-focused approach for your modernization process. So let us begin by contextualizing accessibility in education. For those of us that are more statistically oriented, this slide provides important disability statistics taken from the World Health Organization. In the top right-hand corner, it says that 26% of adults in the United States are disabled, and that's in the United States alone. Below that, we have 1 in 6 people worldwide are disabled. And below that, 60 to 80% of disabled students do not disclose their disability. So that means that they do not share with an advisor, their professors, an accommodations officer, that they are disabled. So reasons for that, for choosing not to disclose, can run the gamut, but typically are due to fear of retribution or discrimination, perhaps concern over lack of support or accommodations in the past, or just as a present concern, or any type of past trauma, or anxiety from disclosing previously. And with these statistics, it's even more imperative that we keep going back to this idea that of all of the different historically marginalized identities and groups or minority groups, disability is the only group that everybody can and likely will join at some point in their lives. So again, when we think about it, it's really meant to be kind of a more collective, comprehensive way of looking at humanity, right? Addressing accessibility from a more universal humanity, human-centric perspective. So if we expand the scope of our context discussion to why accessibility is important in education, we can kind of categorize it into different impact areas. And what we see here on this screen is not a finite list, but it can be a helpful starting point. So in the top left-hand corner, from a recruitment perspective, addressing accessibility also helps reach a greater number of potential students. It opens the door to those that are disabled and perhaps have had a poor experience accessing digital content or recruitment information with other institutions. It can also align with larger institutional missions or initiatives. Below that, retention-wise, it strengthens the inclusive learning environment by, again, reaching a greater number of students, including our disabled students that need different types of accommodations, or even those that do not have official accommodations, but perhaps can really benefit from the different types of accessibility measures that have been put into place. Focusing on retention can also, as I mentioned, reach a greater number of students, right? So again, it's an important component in thinking of how do we widen the scope of impact. In the top right-hand corner, what we're looking at is learner satisfaction. So for our learners, this would essentially support an inclusive teaching and learning environment by ultimately strengthening a strong sense of belonging and inclusion so that our learners feel seen and heard and that the institution resonates with them. And this naturally can, help where students are able to know and feel that they can equitably participate in all of the different activities in their learning, etc. And our last category speaks broadly to more legal and regulatory requirements. So with increasing developments in accessibility related policies and legislation, such as the Title II update of the Americans with Disabilities Act or the European Accessibility Act, ensuring our content is accessible is even more important, right? It is mandated. So the inclusion of digital accessibility in policies and legislation emphasizes the need to ensure, again, that all of our students have equitable access to their learning content. I've always found it a best practice to define the thing that we're talking about, right? So it seems that it might be a little more simple, but again, I think it helps to ensure that we're all on that equitable landing page, if you will. So the definition of digital accessibility that I like to use is from the Georgetown University Law School. And it says that digital accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites, digital tools, and technologies by people with disabilities. So if we think a little bit about how this relates directly to your modernization efforts and where exactly does accessibility fit in, let us consider the type of content that would fall under the purview of digital accessibility. So this would include, but is not limiting to, your Word documents, your PowerPoints, your PDFs, your images. And then of course we have what's called our WYSIWYG content. So WYSIWYG is an acronym that stands for what you see is what you get. And that is specifically referring to the content instructors are building directly in Blackboard. So what are you using or what are you building into that rich content editor? Would that be a Learn Ultra document? Is it a learning module? Is it a description of a assignment, etc.? So I think it's always important to look at the why. Before we look into the how and some suggestions, why does accessibility matter? So again, this list is not finite, but absolutely a good jumping off point. First and foremost, accessibility is always the right thing to do. We can't always know the needs of our students and our learners, but if we can design with accessibility in mind and make it as universally accessible and equitable as possible, it absolutely helps in terms of creating that stronger learning environment. And more importantly, well, not necessarily more importantly, but on a similar note in terms of importance, it affords learners more autonomy in their learning engagement. So as somebody that has, very much so a long history of lived experience of being disabled, I can say that autonomy doesn't always go hand in hand with being disabled. So the more opportunities we have to encourage that, to offer that, the better. by addressing accessibility, and why accessibility matters is that it helps to remove barriers or obstacles that absolutely prevent disabled or not disabled learners from engaging with learning content. So again, making sure that this is a inclusive learning space open to all students. And inclusive design and accessibility absolutely improve the experience for all learners. So I think an excellent example of that would be a curb cut. So a curb cut is an example of universal design. It was designed to help, actually, it was designed to help disabled veterans returning from World War II that were using wheelchairs to be able to navigate the curbs and sidewalks a little easier and safer. And essentially what happened is it became kind of a physical accessibility hallmark of the disability rights movement in the late 60s, early 1970s in the United States. And now the curb cuts are just a way of life in cities. So they are helpful for people pushing a stroller, somebody that is using a bike or a scooter. Perhaps they're pushing a shopping cart, or they have luggage. Again, designed to help a person that uses a wheelchair navigate the actual streets a little better, and in turn has been beneficial for many others. So now that we have laid the contextual foundation of the importance of addressing accessibility, let us consider how this relates to your modernization efforts as you make that transition to Learn Ultra. So we are very excited that you're modernizing. This is going to be a wonderful experience in the long run. The setup of Ultra is sleek and intuitive and really pedagogically supportive for our instructors. So we're very excited that you are making this transition. So let us consider then some of the reasons why right now is a good time to address accessibility in your modernization efforts. It's a very fair question, right? You might be wondering, why should I be doing this now if I'm already in the thick of making this transition? So to begin, it really is always a good time to work on accessibility. So ensuring again that our learners have equitable access from the very outset, right? Or onset, I should say, is a really important and fundamental component to creating, but also sustaining an inclusive teaching and learning environment. And in the confines of your modernization workflow, it is an opportune time to review the content for accessibility because you're already doing that. You're already reviewing your content. You're making updates. You're determining what you will carry over and what will not be brought over. So taking the extra time to ensure that the content is accessible and inclusive, it makes complete sense given where you are in your modernization efforts. And again, this is speaking to the fact that you're already in that content or course review process. So factoring in additional time now will be extremely helpful because it can help to reduce the need to remediate that content later on, where typically you're even busier, you're in the throes of teaching, and you might not want to have a student be reaching out about something that is a problem. So being as accessible and inclusive from the beginning will help everybody in the long run. So here we will look at a suggested workflow for addressing accessibility in your modernization efforts. So naturally, this will vary depending on your process and where you are and how your institution is essentially handling it. But this is what we would suggest to get started. So step one, select one course to focus on at a time. So rather than trying to address all of your courses at the same time, even if you're teaching two, right? Just stick with one, break it into these more manageable chunks, and focus on an individual course. Step two is to conduct an informal SWOT analysis of your existing course content. And you can do that by asking yourself the following questions. Is there outdated or irrelevant content that needs to be removed or modified? Do you have a lot of PDFs in your course and perhaps that justifies the need to convert them into different types of content, or perhaps to convert that into an Ultra document that has a lot of strong built-in accessibility components? How accessible is your content? A lot of these different questions, again, can help you determine and kind of come up with a plan for moving forward. The last phase consists of the actual work in making your content more accessible, and that would be the actual remediating, so fixing those accessibility issues. You can use built-in accessibility checkers in your common tools like in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint to address those issues. Or, of course, if you have access to our powerhouse digital accessibility tool, Ally, you can use the instructor feedback feature to identify those accessibility issues in your content and use that context and guidance to fix them. So while the previous slide painted what might seem like a pretty easy workflow, and it is, sometimes it's the toughest part is determining where to begin. So if we go back to this slide, okay, the first step is to select a course, and that seems easy enough, but there's lots of different factors that go into it. So that's really what this slide is about, is helping us to consider how to prioritize the approach and which course to take. So again, what we're trying to do here is think of, how to begin selecting which course to identify and kind of focus on. So selecting where to begin will really, again, be up to the individual instructor in terms of which course should I begin, focusing my efforts on. So while the answer to that question will likely always be the favored, it depends. I do have some questions and considerations to guide you to help determine what class to begin with. So which course will be offered next semester or the soonest, right? So what is more time sensitive? Which course has the most content to sort through? Perhaps it's outdated or just dated and you haven't addressed it in quite some time, which speaks to that fourth point, that it hasn't been reviewed in quite some time. Which of the courses has the most accessibility issues? Perhaps you've already used Ally in your course review, and you know that your one course has a very low score for its overall score. Maybe perhaps that's the right place to begin. Or maybe you have high volume classes that have consistent enrollment numbers, could be a general ed course or another required course for your particular discipline. Again, keep these questions in mind to help you determine which course to start with. So the next several slides are really going to be focused on common accessibility issues. And these are common accessibility issues that are typically detected either using Ally or other types of accessibility checkers like those in Microsoft or even Adobe Acrobat Pro. So we're going to start with alternative text, but I wanted to take a moment just to talk through the structure of this slide and all of the other subsequent slides that are focused on common accessibility issues. On the left-hand column, we'll look at the what and the why. So we'll define what the actual issue is and what it means, and then we'll talk about why it's so important to address it. On the right column, it will be how to do so, and that would be from a mechanical perspective, but then also conceptual, what are some of the general tips to consider? So one of the most common accessibility issues that we see is missing alternative text. Alternative text is a textual or written description of images, graphs, photos, and that is used when the actual images are not visible to the learner. And that might be because they cannot see the image due to an actual disability, or they have a vision impairment, or perhaps they're not by their device at the moment and they're listening to it from their text-to-speech tool in Microsoft Immersive Reader. Whatever the reason, this is providing that textual description of the image. And it provides then an equitable experience for learners that cannot see the actual image. So some of the benefits of alt text are that it will be read by assistive technology. So again, your screen readers, if you have students using different types of text-to-speech functionality where what is on the actual document will be read out loud for them, it will be picked up. The alt text will be picked up. And so then again, that is what makes it accessible for our students that are unable to view the image for whatever the reason may be. And it also allows for images to be searched. That really just enhances its usability and accessibility. It ensures that all users have access to crucial information, right? So that's really that equitable experience. And it also, interestingly enough, will display if the image fails to load. So for whatever reason, if an image does not actually load, as long as there's alternative text, it will appear. So if we move over to the right side of things, There are many ways that we can address adding alternative text, but naturally, it really does depend on the program or tool that you are using. So for example, Microsoft Word and PowerPoint are two of the most widely used tools by our faculty and instructors. If you wanted to add alt text to an image in one of those tools, you could right click on the image. That's one way of doing it. And then there will be a menu that pops up and you'll select view alt text and enter it in there. The other option is going to the picture format tab in the ribbon and selecting view alt text or simply alt text. Now, if you also ran your document through the accessibility checker and there was alternative text missing, it would pop up as an issue to address. But as far as the general tips for writing strong alt text, this is typically where a lot of instructors get, and understandably so, where they get kind of held up and a little overwhelmed, because adding it is relatively easy, but knowing how to write it is a different story. So generally, the purpose of alt text is to make is for the description to be short and sweet. Okay, so keep it short, but still actually demonstrate or illustrate and state the information that you can discern from the actual image. Okay, so you want to stay objective. So this is important, right? Because this is typically where, as instructors, a lot of the times we might read into an image and want to provide our 2 cents or our analysis. You do not want to do that with alternative text because it should be equitable. You want to give your students and learners the ability to do that on their own, but still provide the same basic information. The other thing to think about is the context. The context is key, right? So you could essentially have the same image being used in different spaces and with different audiences or contexts, and the context behind it might be different. So I think a really good example is, as a history instructor, if I'm teaching a course on, American history from the civil or from up until the American Revolution, and I want to focus on the Declaration of Independence. So I include an image of that. And the purpose for that is to go through all of the different grievances against King George, right? King George II, who was the British monarch at the time of the Revolution. So that is the focus in that context. But let's say the following week, I really want to talk about the preservation of historical documents. And I want to talk about the characteristics of historical documents. Well, I wouldn't be so focused at all on the grievances. It would be more about the appearance of the document. Are there stains? Can you see the discoloration? Things like that. So just again, remember that context is key. And you also have the ability to mark an image as decorative if it is not conveying any additional information. So while we're still on the topic of alternative text, I just wanted to do a brief alternative text exercise. So we have here an image of a bear. And what I'm asking you to do is to consider which alt text best fits this image. So the first example or option would be zoomed in on the face of a brown bear gazing majestically. Perhaps it is hungry, pensive. Number 2, brown bear, grizzly bear, mammal, carnivore. Number 3, brown bear. Number 4, close-up of a brown bear's face. So take just a moment to consider which of these you think would best fit the image. So thank you for participating. So for those of you that are just dying to know, of these options, the best option, the best choice is number 4, close-up of a brown bear's face. This is objective. It does not provide personal perception of the image like in number 1. It's short and sweet, but also containing the facts. What do we see in this image? Number 3 is too short. What about the brown bear? Is there a background? Is the brown bear, is there, something else about the background that would then add into the context that that student needs? Number 2 is really just a list of different nouns and adjectives. So we're not really, that's not very helpful in this case. Number 1, again, reading into it, we don't know if the bear is hungry. Who knows if this is, I might think this looks majestic, but somebody else might disagree. So that's really where we want to stay as objective as possible. Color contrast is another common accessibility issue. So it refers to the color of the text or an image against the background color, right? So the contrast between the color of that text or image and the background color. That's really what we mean by this. So for example, black text on a white background would be considered sufficient. Okay, so that is a strong example of sufficient color contrast. Insufficient would be lighter text on a white background. So if you had like a light green or light orange text on a white background, it would make it really difficult to read. And having strong or sufficient or high contrast, yes, makes it easier to read for all learners, but it also helps learners with visual impairments like color blindness or low vision, and ultimately just improves the usability of websites and apps and documents because you don't have the glare coming from the screen. If your resolution is lower, that will make it even harder to discern. So again, these are the reasons why it's so important to have sufficient or high color contrast. How we do that, again, will depend on the tool that you're using. But to help detect any color contrast issues, absolutely use those built-in accessibility checkers. Ally will identify color contrast issues in documents or your WYSIWYG content. There's also there's a lot of free tools, but one that we like is the TPGI's Color Contrast Analyzer. So use whatever you have available to you to help you ensure that you're providing and creating that strong color contrast. Some general tips, again, you want to use high contrast colors like black on a white background, so a darker text on a white background, or if you have a black background using white text or something like that. Again, you want to make it so that that is a strong ratio of color contrast. And the other component is to make sure that you're not using color alone to convey meaning. That's an accessibility best practice because again, for those reasons, if someone has a visual impairment and they're not able to discern what that particular color is being used to convey, then they are missing out and do not have an equitable experience to that content. So just like we did with the alternative text, we're going to do a little bit of a color contrast exercise. So here I have two different examples of text on this slide. They both say the same thing, which is accessible content is better content, because it is. On the left-hand side, we have the first option, which is accessible content is better content, and the color of the text is yellow. On the right-hand side, we have the same text. It says the same thing, but the color of the text is black. So take a moment to think about which would be sufficient. What is the proper choice? So for those of you that guessed the black text on the white background, you're absolutely right. The problem with the other alternative is that it's much too light. It's difficult to discern. I myself do not have any vision impairments, but it's very difficult to read this, and I wrote it. So again, you want to make sure you're providing a strong reading experience for all of our learners. So moving on to missing headings. Headings are another pretty common accessibility issue found in learning content. So headings provide semantic structure and order to a document. So heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, again, it can kind of go on. But some of the benefits of using heading styles include easy navigation, particularly for those using assistive technology. So the actual name of the heading or style, I should say, will be read out loud by a screen reader so that a student or a learner that cannot visually see what's happening on the screen can still get a sense of the semantic structure of the document and they can follow along. They can also jump to the different headings if they need to be able to find the relevant content quickly. And of course, again, it's compatible with assistive technology. And typically headings are larger and more prominent than surrounding text. So that might also be helpful for other learners that have perhaps, some type of vision impairment. And this helps just to kind of make it more prominent and stand out to the rest of the text. But also it is coded properly. And speaking of coding properly, on the right side, we have the how. So you'll want to make sure that you're using built-in styles in the software or tool that you're using to make sure those headings are set appropriately. So for example, in Microsoft Word, in the ribbon up at the top, let's just say you have a Word document opened. you'll want to look for the styles section. And that is where you go and apply to different parts of your text those proper headings. Heading 1, heading 2, paragraph, block quote, table, image, etc. And that's important because that gives the code the right information so that when a student that is using a screen reader or other form of assistive technology, it will pick that up. If you just highlight or underline the title or the title of a different section, that doesn't do anything for the code. So it's important that this is done properly. So some general tips and suggestions would be to stay sequential. So do not skip levels. So you'll want to go, let's say your title would be heading 1 for your main title. And let's say you move on to the first section of your document, you'd want that to be heading 2. And then for each section, same heading 2. And then if you have a subsection, heading 3. So now we will move on to the dreaded scanned PDF. So the best way to describe the relationship between PDFs and accessibility is it is complicated. PDFs are widely used because they do maintain formatting and layout regardless of the different type of device or operating system a learner is using. So you don't have to have a specific program, tool, device in order to open up a PDF. But the makeup and structure of a PDF is more complicated. So this is typically what leads to more accessibility issues, making it harder to remediate and address. And in terms of accessibility, probably the biggest issue when it comes to PDFs is the scanned PDF. So a scanned PDF is essentially a physical document that was scanned as a PDF file, creating a digital copy. It is essentially just an image of a document. So a really good example is, let's say you're teaching a course and you want your students to read one chapter out of a book. You don't want them to buy the entire book. So you scan that one chapter and you scan it onto the printer that is available in your department, right? Whatever your office has available. Essentially what happens is, unless you're using a very highly technical and advanced type of printer that has that proper scanning capability to OCR it is, and OCR stands for optical character recognition. It's essentially just taking a picture of that image. And the problem with that is that there's no alternative text, there's no metadata. So it's completely inaccessible to a student using assistive technology. They have no access to it. And it can't be searched or easily navigated. So this is what really does make it pretty problematic. Additionally, there's other factors that can degrade that PDF quality. So perhaps there's handwriting on the book that you're using to scan, or you can see the dark gutters, right? You can see the spine of the book in the middle and it creates a bit of a shadow. So there's lots of different additional factors that can make scanned PDFs even worse. So from an accessibility standpoint, let's look at some suggestions for how to manage scanned PDFs. In some ways, it might be that avoiding them is not a reality, right? So we understand that, but there are some things that we might be able to do in terms of managing those scanned PDFs that we do need to work with. So the first would be to consider converting it to a Word document or an Ultra document. So if you're converting it to Word, keep in mind that the formatting structure is not a one-to-one. So it might be a little wonky in the Word documents because they have two completely different structures. So you might need to spend a little bit of time on the layout or format of that, but it's a lot easier to do that in Microsoft Word than it is in Adobe Acrobat. And you might not even have access to Adobe Acrobat, which is one of the reasons why we would suggest converting it. Also, if it's possible to take that information and put that into an Ultra document, if you have to copy and paste, depending on how long it is, creating an Ultra document will be really helpful because there's a lot of built-in accessibility features. You can also use your digital libraries or collections to locate different electronic versions. Maybe if you do have autonomy over the content that you select for your course, consider switching to open educational resources or OERs. If supported by your institution, these are typically more accessible and they're built in HTML semantic code. Use Anthology Ally to guide you in addressing your PDFs. Or if you have access to Adobe Acrobat Pro, of course, use that accessibility checker to address the issues and convert to OCR. So OCR is essentially the technical conversion process that takes a scanned PDF into an actual accessible PDF. So now we are going to begin wrapping things up. So I promise not to pontificate too much on the modernization process, but I did want to end with some final thoughts. I think this is a really wonderful opportunity for instructors or course designers to demonstrate your passion for your subject matter and your commitment to excellence in inclusive teaching. Additionally, addressing as many accessibility issues now can reduce time retrofitting that content later on, particularly when you haven't blocked off the time to do that and a student really needs to access something. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, accessible content is always better content. And of course, we believe that accessibility is a journey. I will not break out into a country song, but it's important to remember that this journey is one, and particularly here at Anthology and with our tool Ally, we prioritize and emphasize progress over perfection. So the intention is to learn and grow in our collective knowledge of digital accessibility. It's not to strive for perfection from the outset. We will make mistakes. That is a part of learning, just as we would tell our students and our learners. So keep this in mind as you work through your modernization process, as you strengthen your skills for mediating your content and be more mindful of accessibility best practices, and celebrate your wins, no matter the size. We have some additional resources here for you if you're interested. So please consider these as support mechanisms in your modernization journey. We also have a exemplary course themes and rubric. So for those that are looking to strengthen the pedagogical design of their courses, we have a rubric that is something you can use and participate in to, again, ensure high quality course structure. We have additional Blackboard focused resources. The first site that we have here is for the modernization website. Here is the link to the source that we used for the definition of digital accessibility by Georgetown Law. And now that the presentation part of the webinar is over, we can move on to any questions and answers. If there are specific questions, please reach out to us. We would really like to be able to help answer them and make sure you feel confident and comfortable in approaching accessibility within this larger modernization process. So again, thank you for joining us. We wish you luck in your process. And remember, accessible content is better content.